Picture this. It's mid-January 2026, and four of the most senior officials in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division are sitting down to write resignation letters that will send shockwaves through the federal government. The chief of the section, the principal deputy chief, the acting deputy chief, all of them walking away on the same day for the same reason. And what triggered it wasn't a policy disagreement or a budget cut. It was an order they simply could not follow. This is the story of how America's premier law enforcement agency descended into crisis, how career prosecutors chose principle over paychecks, and how a single controversial decision exposed the fragility of institutions we've taken for granted for decades. When Donald Trump started his second term in January 2025, the Department of Justice became ground zero for what his administration called restructuring and what critics called a purge. The DOJ employs over 110,000 people across the FBI, U.S. attorneys' offices, and civil rights division. It's supposed to be the nation's guardian of justice, investigating crimes and protecting civil rights without political interference, without presidential pressure on individual cases, without loyalty tests that put party over law. That independence isn't just tradition, it's the foundation of the rule of law in a democracy. When Richard Nixon tried to use the DOJ to go after his enemies, it led to the Saturday Night Massacre and became a key factor in his resignation. After Watergate, reforms created walls between the White House and ongoing investigations. Those walls held for decades through both parties. But according to thousands of DOJ employees, something changed in 2025. Throughout that year, reports emerged of unprecedented personnel turnover, reaching deep into career staff who'd spent decades building expertise. Terms like gutted and hollowed out appeared in media coverage. Former DOJ officials estimated that thousands had either resigned or been terminated, though the administration didn't release comprehensive statistics. The first major public crisis came in February 2025, when 5 leaders from the DOJ's public integrity section resigned as a group. This section investigates public officials for corruption. According to news reports, these 5 officials resigned rather than comply with orders from a Trump appointee to dismiss federal bribery and corruption charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Career prosecutors had built a case involving allegations of improper relationships with foreign officials and illegal campaign contributions. Then political appointees allegedly ordered it dropped. The prosecutors faced a choice: follow an order they believed was politically corrupt or walk away. They walked. Now, fast forward to January 2026. The case that triggered the Civil Rights Division resignations involved a woman named Renee Nicole Good, who was reportedly killed by Jonathan Ross. According to MSNBC's exclusive reporting, when the Civil Rights Division was asked to investigate, they were told not to investigate the shooting death itself, not to examine how Good died, or whether her civil rights were violated. Instead, they were directed to investigate Good herself, specifically her affiliations. Think about how extraordinary that is. A woman is killed, and the DOJ's response is to investigate the victim rather than the person who killed her. For the 4 senior officials leading this unit, that order crossed a line they couldn't cross. They understood that investigating a victim's affiliations instead of their death isn't law enforcement, it's political persecution. It's what happens in authoritarian states where the government decides who deserves justice based on their politics. Within hours of receiving that directive, all 4 resigned. Their resignations came amid a broader pattern. Federal judges from both parties began publicly expressing frustration with DOJ performance, noting declined quality in legal filings, missed deadlines, and simple incompetence. When federal judges start openly questioning whether the DOJ knows what it's doing, that's extraordinary. And speaking of judges criticizing the DOJ, let's talk about what was happening simultaneously in New York. U.S. District Judge Allison Nathan was presiding over issues related to the Ghislaine Maxwell case and the Epstein files. After Jeffrey Epstein's death and Maxwell's prosecution, Congress passed the Epstein Transparency Act, requiring the DOJ to release documents by specific deadlines. Those deadlines came and went. The DOJ didn't comply. 2 members of Congress, Democrat Ro Khanna and Republican Thomas Massie, filed a letter with Judge Nathan asking her to appoint an independent monitor to force DOJ compliance. They essentially told a federal judge, "We don't trust the executive branch to follow a statute we passed, so we need you to make them do it." Judge Nathan responded with an order legal experts described as extraordinary. She directed the DOJ to respond in writing by January 17, 2026, explaining why they'd missed statutory deadlines. A federal judge demanding the Justice Department explain Why it hasn't complied with an act of Congress represents an extraordinary breakdown in normal government function. All of this happened as Congress itself experienced its own exodus. Representative Neil Dunn, a Republican from Florida and senior committee member, announced he wouldn't seek re-election, joining a growing list of House Republicans calling it quits. Speaker Mike Johnson was reportedly struggling some days to assemble enough votes to pass legislation because members were absent. When your majority is razor thin, every absence matters. Adding to the chaos, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released inflation data showing 2.9% year-over-year headline inflation and 3.2% core inflation, above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. But here's the troubling part. The Bureau itself had experienced massive staffing cuts. Reports suggested 40–50% of consumer price index data now relied on statistical estimates rather than actual measurements. When half your economic data is educated guessing because you don't have enough staff, how confident can anyone be in those figures? President Trump declared the numbers great and demanded Federal Reserve interest rate cuts. But at nearly 3% inflation, that's not how monetary policy works. The disconnect between Trump's statements and economic reality fit a pattern that had become increasingly apparent. Take Iran. On January 2nd, 2026, Trump posted that if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, we are locked and loaded and ready to go. Strong words suggesting imminent military action. Then, according to various reports, Iranian security forces killed an estimated 3,000 plus protesters over the following 2 weeks. America's response on January 15th, Trump posted, "Help is on its way. I have canceled all meetings with Iranian officials." Notice what's missing. No military action, no locked and loaded. I just canceled meetings and promises. When you make explicit threats and don't follow through, it creates a credibility problem. Or consider the credit card saga. Trump announced he was capping credit card interest rates at 10%, presenting it as an executive decree. One problem, the president doesn't have legal authority to cap rates charged by private institutions. That requires legislation. Speaker Johnson publicly warned against it. Within days, Trump was reportedly telling advisors they'd need to work on a consensus rather than implementing the cap. Another dramatic announcement quietly walked back when reality intervened. Then there was Minnesota. Trump posted, "Do the people of Minnesota really want to live in a community with thousands of convicted murderers, drug dealers, rapists? Fear not, great people in Minnesota. The day of reckoning and retribution is coming." This came as ICE reportedly deployed additional personnel to Minneapolis and St. Paul. Reports emerged that ICE had dramatically lowered hiring standards, reduced background checks, lower fitness requirements, shorter training, but higher signing bonuses. A Slate reporter even claimed he was offered an ICE position despite not completing domestic violence screening or drug testing. And just when you thought it couldn't get stranger, Republican Representative Randy Fine introduced legislation to make Greenland the 51st U.S. state. Greenland is self-governing. Denmark has repeatedly stated it's not for sale. The notion of unilateral U.S. acquisition has no basis in international law. Meanwhile, Americans are struggling with housing costs and inflation, and Congress is introducing bills to acquire Arctic territories. From the perspective of those who resigned, their reasoning was clear. Career prosecutors serve justice and law, not any particular administration. When they believe political considerations override legal obligations, resignation becomes the only principled choice. They're also bound by State Bar Association rules. Participating in politically motivated decisions could cost them their law licenses. The Trump administration hasn't released detailed explanations for the decisions that triggered these resignations. Without official statements, we're left with silence that itself becomes part of the story. If you have a strong defense, why not make it publicly? What we can say with certainty is that the cumulative effect suggests significant institutional breakdown. When you lose career professionals through mass resignations, you lose expertise that takes decades to develop. When federal judges publicly question DOJ competence, when presidential threats prove empty, when announced policies evaporate, government credibility suffers domestically and internationally. Here's what we know for certain. Multiple senior DOJ officials resigned over investigative decisions they couldn't accept. A federal judge ordered the DOJ to explain failure to comply with an act of Congress. Congressional Republicans continued retiring despite a narrow majority. Inflation remained above target. Presidential statements on Iran, credit cards, Minnesota, and Greenland raise questions about the relationship between words and actions. What we don't know is the full picture of internal deliberations, the complete extent of personnel changes, or the long-term consequences of this institutional disruption. But we do know this: when career prosecutors resign en masse rather than follow orders, that's not normal. When federal judges demand explanations for why the Justice Department isn't following the law, that's not normal. When presidential threats are followed by inaction, when announced policies disappear without explanation, none of that is normal. The officials who resigned from the DOJ in January 2026 made a calculation. They decided that their professional integrity and commitment to the rule of law mattered more than their careers. They decided that some orders can't be followed, some lines can't be crossed, and some institutions are worth protecting, even if it means walking away from them. History will judge whether they were right. History will judge whether the institutional damage we're witnessing is reversible, but we don't have the luxury of waiting for history's judgment. We're living through this moment right now, making choices about what we'll accept, what we'll tolerate, and what we'll resist. The DOJ officials who resigned have made their choice. The question is, what will the rest of us choose? Thanks for watching.